This is section 2 of the Bible survey course, a section on creation. This is actually part 1 of 3 of a study of the beginnings. We need to look at the complex matter of creation. The diversity of interpretation surrounding Genesis 1 through 2 is not new. If you're at all familiar with some of the engaging controversies and debates and arguments that go on today surrounding the creation, the interpretation of Genesis chapter 1 and 2, it might seem like this is something new depending on who you're listening to. But in reality, there's been a variety of understandings presented from the historical context. This is not necessarily or specifically a post-Darwin issue, though many think that it may be. In fact, a guy like Augustine, even from back in the early centuries of the church, like many of the other early church leaders, believed that creation was an instantaneous event, which would not be in keeping with a literal understanding of 6 consecutive days of the creation narrative that we see in Genesis chapter 1. Though many of the early church fathers would have viewed the 6 days of creation as literal or consecutive or 24-hour days, but they would often interpret each day with an allegorical meaning on top of its literalness. And so even before some of the more modern scientific understandings of how the world functions, the sun being the center of our particular solar system, the planets in motion rather than at a fixed point, and those kinds of things, even prior to all of those speculations, there were a lot of conversations about how we should understand the creation narrative, how it should relate to what we observe in the natural world, what was the purpose of why it was written. And so these complex matters are not new. They're just to have greater levels of nuance now because of the things that people understand about science and the created world around us. So what we're going to do with this lecture is we're going to actually cover some of the major views on creation. And so there's several views of creation in the interpretation of Genesis 1 and 2 that exist in the Christian world. So this particular section, this lesson, will survey and cover the major views. It's going to evaluate their pros and their cons. This is not necessarily going to point you to this is the exact view that you must hold to. What it's going to do is it's going to present the different views hopefully in a fair and balanced sort of way. And then at the end, it's going to give an analysis of what is necessary to believe for Christian orthodoxy. There's a lot of times that people want to stretch out certain viewpoints as being more necessary to orthodoxy than not. And that begins to exclude certain people from the history of the church and their interpretations of creation, the creation narrative, Genesis 1 and 2, without taking into serious account the core orthodox ideas, the Trinity, the Incarnation, crucifixion for sin, the resurrection of the dead, the literal resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead, and those kinds of things. Sometimes some of these issues get pressed in on that more core orthodox circle. And so at the end of this, we'll just give a brief evaluation of each view, its pros, its cons, the things that need to be thought about, the questions that should be made, and then we'll give an analysis of what is necessary. So let's start with the classic 24-hour day view. This view teaches that each day listed in Genesis chapter 1 is a literal 24-hour day. Not only that, this view also understands the events of Genesis 1 to be sequential. In other words, they happened in the order that they're listed. So it says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was formless, it was void. And it says, and God said, let there be light. And so the very first thing that happened is that there was light. And he saw that the light was good. He separated the light from the darkness. And evening and morning he called the first day. And then you move to the creation of the firmaments, the sea and the sky. Then you move to the creation of land, space, and vegetation. And then you move to the luminaries on the 4th day, the creation of the different lights and the stars and the sun and the moon for the giving of seasons. Then you move to the emergence of animals from the sea and animals in the sky on the 5th day. And then you move to land, beasts, creeping, crawling things, and the creation of humankind on the 6th day. And so this view would view that each one of those evening and morning days is a literal 24-hour block of time in the same way that we would understand it today, and that the events that occur are sequential events. This view is also understood to be what's called the young earth view, teaching that the world is less than 10,000 years old. For those who are much more aggressive and specific in their dating, it would actually be 6,000 years old or less. The Jewish calendar, the more Orthodox Jewish calendar, actually has a very specific numerical date in mind, and you can Google that to see what the specific date from that perspective would be. But there are very few young Earth proponents that would view the world to be any more than about 10,000 years old. This view can be traced back in some variety to the writing of the earliest theologians of the church. And so their writings point out to us this reality of people understanding these days to be actual 24-hour days, the earth not being that old, and that sort of thing. For a very comprehensive evaluation of this perspective, you can visit the website answersingenesis.org, and there's an entire series of videos and articles and books, pamphlets, and that sort of thing that you can view on their website, and some material that you can order if you wanted to do that. You could also go to YouTube or Google and just type in, Answers in Genesis. The director there is Ken Ham. You could type in his name, and there would be an opportunity for you to look and see some presentations, some debates, some dialogues with people who don't necessarily hold this view, and see some comparison and some contrast. Now, on this 24-hour day view, there are some pros. There's some very positive things about the view. First, it takes seriously the plain reading of the text from Genesis 1, particularly the part about there being an evening and a morning. That seems to be strongly implying that it's a normal day as we understand it. There's nighttime, there's daytime. There's nighttime, there's daytime. And that marks out each day from the other one. This view takes that extremely seriously, and that seems to be the plain reading of the text. It also takes seriously the repeated expression throughout Scripture, in 6 days the Lord made. You see that in the Ten Commandments in Exodus 20. You see it in a variety of other places in the Old Testament. It's even expressed again in the New Testament. There seems to be some implications. It was 6 days. There's actual 6 days of creation. There doesn't seem to be any other understanding or interpretation as far as the worldview and grid of the writers of the various parts of Scripture. And so it takes that very seriously, that seems to be the repeated mantra, 6 days, 6 days, 6 days. It also could be best described as the most theologically consistent understanding of original sin, death, and fall by way of Adam and Eve. If the world is made in this time frame, if it's made in the way that it is just plainly stated to have been made in Genesis chapter 1 and 2, then you have this progression of there only being 2 humans on the earth. There's nobody else here. Those 2 humans fall into sin. They plummet the rest of their generations that come after them into sin, fall, original sin, the violation of the divine mandate, and all of those kinds of things. This really does seem to be the most theologically consistent view to help understand those things in a proper, larger Orthodox Christian context. Now, there are a few cons to this view. It appears to be inconsistent with observations of the natural world, also known as natural theology. Now, in our more modern times, for a lot of evangelicals, there's been a great move away from natural theology, which is very unfortunate. The Scripture teaches us, even post-fall, that the observations that we make about the created world around us, the world as it is, actually show us the signs of the Creator. Romans chapter 1 is this. Paul makes this argument as to why people everywhere are without excuse. Psalm 19 makes this declaration that the heavens are continuing to tell the glory of God. And so when we come to the natural world, you run into some problems because the testings and the observations that are made seem to show that the world is a very old place. It seems to show a progression of life cycles. It seems to show that there are great distances of light that must be traveled in order for the stars to reach us, and that requires an extensively long amount of time. And of course, there's a lot of responses that the 24-hour day view gives to this, that the world was made to appear old. Of course, that then begs the question, has God deceived us through what is made, if what's made is supposed to show us the glory of God and supposed to help us understand God in a truthful way, if he's made it to appear a way that it's not, wouldn't that not be misleading in our quest to see God through the natural order? There's also some who argue that the fall is what plummeted the world into some of the things that give it the appearance of what it is, that it created a cosmic downfall. Of course, the great difficulty with that is those passages in the scripture that say we can understand God through what's been made, that we can come to at least some sort of scant knowledge of the truth about God, and even more so if we put both books together, the books of Revelation and the books of nature together, that we can come to a very full understanding of God. That would seem to indicate that there's such a mar on what's been made because of the fall that wouldn't be functional anymore. But the scripture itself seems to say that it still is. And so that seems to be inconsistent with the observations of the natural world. The second con is that it does not allow for alternate understandings of the word day, even in the context of Genesis 1 and 2. An example of this comes from Genesis chapter 2, verse 4. It says there in that text, "Now in the day that the Lord made the heavens and the earth," and it just uses the singular day for the word yom for in Hebrew for day, like it does in all the other places. But it's very clear from that context, if we're taking the 6 days to be sequential literal days, then God made the world in 6 days and he rested on the seventh. He couldn't have made it in a day. It wouldn't have been instantaneous. And so it would have been days plural, but it's not, it's singular. And so the use of the word day there is the way that it is often used in our language and in Hebrew. It has multiple meanings, and it doesn't really allow for alternate understandings of that word to be used in the context of Genesis 1 and 2. A lot of times you'll hear people say, a day means day. That's what it means. Well, until you get to another section of the same part where it doesn't mean that. And so that's one of the cons of this view. Another con of this view is that it does not give a good accounting for the creation of the sun on day 4, which is explicitly stated to be used for our modern proper understanding of 24-hour time measurement, found in Genesis 1:14 through 19. This is one of the great criticisms that has been brought against this view from very early on. God explicitly states in the text, you'll use these luminaries on day 4, the sun and the moon and the stars, for the measurement of seasons and days and times and that sort of thing. And so if that instrument is not available for timekeeping as we understand it until halfway through the 6 days of creation, then how do we properly understand 24-hour blocks of time as evening and morning in the first 3 days of creation? And so this is, and again, this is just asking questions that the text is stating plainly, because that's what this view, again, that's a great pro from this view. It takes very seriously the plain reading of the text. Well, the plain reading of the text seems to indicate that the time measurement standard doesn't occur until halfway through. And so that does create a little bit of a difficulty as far as embracing wholeheartly the view that is presented here. So that's just a brief evaluation of the 24-hour day view. Now, we also have what's known as the day-age theory. Now, this view considers each day of creation to be more of an era or an age, an unspecified amount of time, marking out a unique period. What this view does is it allows for unlimited amounts of time for each day. This view has many different adherents and expressions. Oftentimes it comes to us from old earth creationists, from theistic evolutionists, from progressive creationists. And to gain a better understanding of this view, you could go to reasons.org. It's a group called Reasons to Believe. And so a lot of different people hold to this, but basically the days are eras, they're ages, and they represent lengthy periods of time. Now, the day-age theory has some pros to it. This view allows for the diverse meaning of the Hebrew word for day, or yom, which I mentioned before, to be applied to the creation narrative. In some context, it is 24-hour days. Some context, it's only the daytime. Some context, it is the days of so-and-so, such and such, or whatever king. And it talks about the entire lifespan, in the day that the Israelites were in captivity, and it talks about the large stretch of time that they were there. And so the word can be used used in a variety of ways, and this allows for it to be used in that diverse fashion here in this text. This view also eliminates the sun made on the fourth day problem and the telling of strict time by allowing each age to be an extended period of time. We're not as constrained to, well, how do you have a 24-hour day without the measurement and standard that God has given for that day. This allows that. This view seems to be in greater agreement with natural observation, or the outworkings of natural theology, the things that when we test and we make observations, the conclusions that we would seem to rightly come to. This seems to be in greater agreement with it than, say, the 24-hour day theory would. Now, the cons of this view is that the biblical sequence, even in age form, is not in keeping with most scientific data. Even following the progression of the ages listed in the Genesis narrative doesn't really seem to follow the progressions that we would observe when we study the world that's been made around us. It's also difficult to demonstrate that the author's intent was ages rather than actual day-night periods because of the wording of the evening and the morning motif. That is, again, one of the strong realities from the 24-hour day period. This becomes a con for this one because it doesn't really take into account that continual repetition of evening and morning, and that would seem to give over to a difficulty for this view. This view is often accused of giving authority to the book of nature rather than the book of Scripture. In classic theology, there is an understanding that God has shown himself through his two books. He has the book of Revelation, known to us as the Scripture, where he has specifically revealed things about himself, whether personally, whether through visions that people have had, through prophetic utterances, through the law, through the sacrificial system, whatever it may be. And then he's also revealed himself to us through the book of nature, that which has been made. And that by reading both of these books as correctly as we can, we come to a full and comprehensive understanding of who God is and what he's like. Many accuse this view of saying that the book of nature is superior to the book of Scripture, which in classic theology has always been the other way around. Now, one other view is the literary framework approach. Now, this view considers the seven-day creation narrative to be a literary device, that this is actually just a method of storytelling, that this is just a way of presenting some information about what God's character is like. This view teaches that the creation narrative has nothing to do with time, and perhaps nothing to do with methodology of creation either, how creation was made. That's not really the point of why this is laid out the way that it is laid out. This view emphasizes the parallel relationships between day 1 and 4, day 2 and 5, and day 3 and 6. And I'm going to show you a picture of what that looks like here. On day 1, we have the creation of light. And then on day 4, we have the creation of the luminaries, or the lights. And so, God said, let there be light. Day 4, God, let there be lights to fill the sky, greater light to rule the day, lesser light to rule the night. And so we have this parallel on day 1 and day 4. You have a similar parallel on day 2 and day 5, where you have the creation of the sky and the sea. Then you have the creation of animals that fill the sky and animals that fill the sea on the 5th day. And so you follow up with the same pattern on day 3, where you have land and vegetation being formed, and then you have land animals and mankind being formed on the 6th day. And so each one of these has a direct parallel. Those who hold these views look at these as the triads. There's these 3 days, these 2 triads that come together, and they represent 2 kingdom motifs. They represent the physical kingdom to be occupied, light, sky, water, land, and they represent the kingdom's creatures, the lights that fill what that true light would be, the birds and the fish that fill the sky and the water, the land animals and humankind that fill the land that has vegetation. And it emphasizes the 7th day, because the 7th day is very distinct in this creation story, and it's kind of the crowning event. On the 7th day, God rested. There's no evening and morning. It's very distinct from the other ones. And so for a better understanding of this, I've listed a website here, but the name that you want to know is Meredith Kline, very strong proponent of the literary framework approach. And many argue that this may have been the perspective that, say, Augustine would have held to in his understanding of what was going on with the creation narrative. Now, the literary framework approach has some pros to it. It does not have to concern itself with any of the scientific theories, because that's not the point of what's being done in Genesis chapter 1 and 2. Genesis chapter 1 and 2 is not trying to give us some sort of cosmology, some sort of understanding of the actual creation. It's not trying to teach us physics. It's not trying to teach us astronomy. It's not trying to teach us life sciences. It's not trying to talk to us about the mechanisms that God used. It's simply trying to give us a strong emphasis to the distinct nature of the seventh day, and it's trying to give us a legitimacy to the apparent poetic structure of Genesis 1 and strong support for the creation narrative as a polemic against other creation narratives at the time. And so if you were to do some study to see how other people groups around at that time understood the creation, often there was a mass of humanity that would be created. They were created to be slaves of the gods, and their life and existence was brutal and harsh and lacked value and meaning and worth. And you see that the creation of humankind as a crowning jewel of creation, made in the image of God, given sacred word and sacred space and a sacred place, that these sorts of things really kind of speak out against the false nature of other gods and why the world is the way that it is, and to the true nature of a creation being a reflection of the glory of God and being a gift to humanity to help reflect His glory in the world, and those sorts of things. Now, the cons to this view is that it minimizes the clear emphasis on time in Genesis 1. It's very clear. There's evening and there's morning. There's the first day. There's the second day. There's the third day. And there's this strong emphasis on time itself, which this view seems to ignore completely. And so that is a definite negative to this particular view. This view also minimizes the emphasis of in 6 days the Lord made, which we saw was a strong pro for the 24-hour day theory. It doesn't really seem to take seriously this comprehensive world view that people had, that this really was a 6-day reality. Now, it's also considered by some to be too allegorical. It's not taking seriously the literal surface meaning of the text, what is actually present on the surface in plain view on the text. It doesn't seem to be taking that very seriously. And for many, when you begin to allegorize that deeply, it becomes a bit unnerving, especially for those in the evangelical community. Another view is the prior creation view. This view teaches that there was a creation in Genesis 1:1, followed by a recreation in Genesis 1:3. This is also known as the gap theory. This view teaches that most of the extended scientific ages that we gain through making observations of the natural world occurred in that first creation. This view typically holds that the second creation had a literal 24-hour day block like the 24-hour day view. And so essentially what it's doing, it's combining the idea of extended days, long stretches of period of time, with a literal 24-hour making of the world, but it's doing it in a two-creation narrative. And so what a lot of theologians have said is that Genesis 1:1 says, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. And you have this very odd structure in Genesis 1:2, and the earth was formless and void, and darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit was hovering over the surface of the waters. And then you have in 1:3, it said, and God said, let there be light. And this darkness, this void, this emptiness, this chaos that seems to be there in 1:2, sometimes it's attributed to the fall of Satan. There's a lot of other things that it's attributed to, depending on how the viewpoint's being presented. But essentially what it's saying is that God created everything, and that there was life, and that there was life cycles, and that there were things going on. And then some cataclysmic event occurred that essentially devastated all of creation as we would completely understand it, and that God had to reorder it, restructure it, remove the chaos from it, and basically do a new creation. And so that's how this view works. Some more information on this, you can see some of the Scofield Reference Bible notes on Genesis 1:2, and that would give you some lead outs to some other things to look at. Now, some of the pros of the prior creation model. It maintains a strict adherence to the literal meaning of the text, at least as it relates to the second creation. It also allows for a literal interpretation alongside an acceptance of modern scientific understanding. So by making this division, yes, there's these long bridges of time that go and stretch way back, and we can kind of observe this from the fossil record and the geological record and those kinds of things. And then a cataclysmic event occurred and a recreation had to take place. And what we now have from the rest of the Genesis narrative is an explanation of that recreation. It takes seriously the very odd textual construction of Genesis 1-2. It's very strange to talk about the chaos and the emptiness and the void and the darkness. And you have God making the heavens and the earth, and then there's this darkness, there's this void, there's this chaos, there's this emptiness. When you really evaluate the Hebrew text, it just seems like there's some sort of cataclysmic, chaotic, just tumultuous turmoil that's happening. And a lot of other creation narratives don't really give serious accounting to what does that mean? What's going on with that? What is happening there? And this view really does seem to try to attribute something meaningful to that. And so that's a strong pro for this. Now, the cons, though, is that the entire theory has little support from the immediate text of Genesis 1 and 2. It just doesn't really seem to flow well from the text. There's a lot of eisegesis, which means reading into the text, that has to go into Genesis 1:1 to be an entire long, old, dated, life-filled creation, and a lot of reading into, in truth, Genesis 1:2, that it is trying to take seriously, but a lot of reading in that some sort of cataclysmic event is occurring that's wiping out an entire life-filled creation, and then starting over again in Genesis 1:3. The immediate flow of the text just doesn't really seem to support that in an exegetical, reading it out from the text sort of way. It also does not adhere well to the scientific ages that it claims in its first creation. And what is meant by that is that items from the first and second creation often overlap. And so you would clearly, for this other creation to have worked, need it, say, the sun. And you would have needed the moon and the gravitational pull that creates the tides and all of those kinds of things. And if all of that got destroyed by some sort of cataclysmic cosmic event, and then everything got remade where there's a sun and a moon and all those sorts of things in the second literal 24-hour day creation, you have huge overlap of what is necessary for the first creation to have actually been functional. And so there just doesn't really seem to be good adherence to the scientific ages that it seems to be trying to make room for. Now, there's some additional views. There's a few other views out there. One that's not nearly as popular as it once was is what's known as the two-phase view. Basically, there's two distinct creation phases. Genesis 1 is one creation phase. Genesis 2 is the other creation phase. And there's an extensive amount of time between Genesis 2:3 and Genesis 2:4. And so you have this creation that occurs, and then you have a long period of time, and then you have another kind of creation that happens in Genesis chapter 2. The problem with that is that it doesn't take very seriously some of the continuity issues. It doesn't take very seriously some of the scientific era issues in natural theology. It doesn't take very seriously, at least it doesn't seem to, the integration of some of the retellings that happened from part 1 and part 2. Now, there's a few different versions of this. There's a more conservative evangelical view of this particular one. And then there's also a much more liberally minded view that basically says, hey, Genesis 1 and 2 are two completely different stories. They're not even talking about the same thing. And so there's a lot of spectrum on this view. Not nearly as popular as some of the other views, but it is out there and some people do adhere to it. There's also what's known as theistic evolution. And while varying in specifics, the general idea is that there's not a contradiction between God as creator and his use of evolution as the process by which creation of at least life occurs. This is also known as evolutionary creationism. And for further perspective on this, you can go to a website called biologos.org. And you can also Google a search of a modern evangelical that would come closer to adhering to this. You can type in Biologos and Tim Keller, and he actually gave a series of lectures for them kind of talking about the integration of these two ideas together. And so there is this idea that's out there. Now, it doesn't necessarily adhere to a full creation motif, how specifically all of creation came together. It deals more with life sciences, though it does have some ideas about the origins of matter and the material world and that sort of thing as well. So what's necessary? If we're really going to try to settle in, because every view that's been presented has adherents from the evangelical Christian community. It has adherents from people who would claim that they believe the Scripture to be inspired, that they believe the Scripture to be infallible, that they believe the Scripture to be a proper and true accounting of faith and practice for Christians. They would adhere to the idea of sin and original sin and the fall, that they would adhere to the idea of the need of salvation from that sin through the completed work of Jesus Christ on the cross and his resurrection from the dead. They would believe in a future hope, a future life, a future resurrection from the dead. Every view that's been presented, including the view on theistic evolution, from the 24 literal day view all the way through the end, there are proponents that would adhere to a largely conservative evangelical viewpoint. And so that really does beg the question. You have all of these very intelligent, well-read, God-fearing, Jesus-loving people having a lot of different perspectives on how these things are supposed to work out. So what is necessary? There is a diversity of these perspectives held among Christians. And so a quote from J.I. Packer is helpful at this point. He says, Genesis 1 and 2, however, tell us who without giving many answers about how. Some today may think this is a defect, but in the long perspective of history, our present-day scientific preoccupation with how rather than who looks very odd in itself. Rather than criticize these chapters for not feeding our secular interest, we should take from them needed rebuke of our perverse passion for knowing nature without regard for knowing what matters most, namely knowing nature's creator. And that's from his book, Affirming the Apostles' Creed. So what is necessary? So here are a list of the necessary things, and these have been necessary throughout all of Christian orthodoxy, across all of the umbrellas of Christendom. Here are the necessary things. There must be an affirmation of God as the maker of heaven and earth. And this is clear from the earliest creeds, even the second century version of the Apostles' Creed, which differs some from our modern version that comes down from about the 7th or 8th century. The earliest creed, I believe in God the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth. There's an affirmation as God as creator. There's not a divorcing of the natural from the supernatural. That would become a form of Gnosticism or true naturalism, which would lend itself towards agnosticism or atheism. As a Christian, there must be the affirmation of the supernatural. There must be the affirmation of a spiritual reality to everything that's actually going on. There must be the affirmation of an unseen realm as well as a seen realm. There also must be an affirmation of the continuity of humanity as it relates to the following things. There must be a continuity in humanity as it relates to the image of God. There must be a continuity of humanity as it relates to sin and our rebellion against that image. And there must be a continuity of humanity as it relates to the necessity of salvation, that there is a reason why Jesus Christ has come into the world, and it's to save people from their sins. The how and the what of creation and its textual interpretation have had many viewpoints in the church, many preceding the modern scientific controversies. And so these kinds of things... this preceding of the modern scientific issue makes it very difficult, because prior to Darwin, prior to the theory of evolution, prior to some of the understandings that occurred back at the development of the telescope and understanding that the sun was the center of the universe and not the earth, many scientific controversies have brewed over the years, but there have been interpretations and speculations about the nature of creation and the proper understanding of Genesis 1 and 2 well before all of those things. And so this is not anything new. And so the how and the what, this question has been going on for a long time. And so what is always needed what's most necessary above all is the pursuit of humility, to be humble, to understand that we strive the best that we can to understand the best that we can, but that our understanding will always be at least somewhat incomplete, that it will be marred by our own biases, by our own prejudices, by the baggage that we bring, by the cultural upbringing that we have, by the way that we define some of our terms. These sorts of things are always going to kind of skew the way that we view the information that we have and how we bring the information together. And so for the Christian, humility is actually the most necessary thing, to approach these matters humbly and with due respect to other people, understanding that there has always been a diversity of engagement in these. And what we need to do is approach each one of these viewpoints based on the merit of its own presentation. We need to ask the very difficult questions. Is this sensible based on what the text is saying? Is this exegetically sound, or is it a lot of eisegesis, a lot of reading into the text? Does this sensibly connect the text with the observational world around us? Are we able to open both books of God, the book of Scripture and the book of nature, and come to a sound consensus as to how these things are working together and interplaying with one another? A few recommendations. And so you want to check out the various links that have been mentioned in this lecture, going to visit those websites, watching their videos, reading their articles, checking out some of their books and some of their materials. It's a great way to start. But also, you want to check out the reading list on the main page of this lesson. There is a recommended reading page. It'll get you started. Those books and resources will then point you to other books and resources. Now, remember, this is a survey. This is just trying to present information and material. It's not necessarily trying to come to a lot of conclusions, but it's trying to help us learn to think through specialized issues as we go along the way. Most of our journey through the Scriptures is not going to have this many complex nuances to it. Creation narrative and issues about how old the world is and humanity and those kinds of things. Very nuanced. It always has been. When we get to understandings of what Christ did on the cross later in the New Testament, it'll be the same. There's a lot of theological nuances to that. When we deal with the dating ages of when certain events in the Old Testament took place, there'll be some nuances to that as well. How do we understand some textual variations that occur? And how do we read those into the historical things that we see that help give it support? And as we go along, we'll do that. Not necessarily saying this is the only way you should view this or the best way you should view this, but these are ways that it can be viewed. And these things need to be evaluated on their own merit. And they need to be approached with an open mind. They need to be approached with humility. They need to be approached with God-honoring respect for the other as an image bearer of God. And there's a lot of very, very Christ-honoring people who hold different viewpoints about this. And so in some of your free time, if you want to really pursue after this specialized issue, there is the reading list, there is the links that's been mentioned, and you can pursue these things. There's a lot of time that can be spent, a lot of evaluation that can be made, and it will be a worthwhile study. So I would encourage you, make sure that you've done your reading, check out some of those recommended things, check out some of those other links, and let's have a lifetime of learning together.